Salem was never about witches. In fact, when I was younger, I thought that the Salem witch trials was just another strange chapter in American history, or a bunch of superstitious Puritans convinced that witches were lurking around every corner. It felt so distant from modern life that it read like folklore. But the more I read about Salem, the less that I think that this is a story about witches and is instead a story about something much more frightening. It's a story about fear and about what happens when ordinary people become convinced that they're fighting an invisible evil. The first thing that surprises me the most about Salem is how much Hollywood has gotten wrong. No one was burned at the stake during the Salem witch trials. That image has become so deeply embedded in our minds that most of us assume it is a historical fact. But it actually belongs to European witch persecutions. In Salem, 19 people were hanged. One man was crushed beneath heavy stones, and several others died in prison. The real story doesn't need embellishment because it's already horrifying. Then I came across something called spectral evidence. And suddenly, Salem stopped feeling like history and started feeling more like a ghost story. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your neighbor had dreamed about you the night before, and they swear that your spirit stood beside their bed. They swear that they felt your hands around their throat, and they swear that they saw your face. And now all of a sudden you're standing in a court trying to prove that your ghost wasn't there. There's no fingerprints, no physical evidence, no witnesses, just someone's claim that an invisible specter had appeared to them in that night. How do you defend yourself against that? And how do you prove that your ghost didn't do something? The more I think about it, the more I realize that the accused were not just fighting for their innocence, they were fighting accusations that they couldn't actually disprove. Then there's the story of Giles Corey. He was an 81-year-old farmer who refused to enter a plea, and under English law, the court couldn't just proceed without one. So rather than abandoning the case, officials laid him on the ground, placed a wooden board across his chest, and began stacking heavier and heavier stones on top of him. For 2 days, they demanded that he plead, and according to accounts, his only response was more weight. Whether those were his exact final words or not, they've become one of the most haunting acts of defiance in American history. Sometimes I wonder how quiet Salem must have been after his death. Imagine walking home after you had just watched an elderly man slowly crushed beneath stones, and then believing that justice had been served. What struck me the most wasn't simply the brutality of his death, but it's the realization that most people carrying it out almost certainly believed that they were doing something righteous. And that's the part I think that we often overlook when we study history, because it's comforting to imagine that evil announces itself and that villains know that they're the villains, that we would recognize injustice the moment that we saw it. But Salem doesn't tell us that story. Salem tells us that ordinary people, whether it's parents, friends, neighbors, they can become convinced that they're protecting their families, defending their faith, and saving their community from an unseen threat. The village became haunted not by witches, but by fear itself. And every strange illness became evidence, every nightmare became testimony, every unexplained misfortune suddenly needed a human face. Eventually, even children weren't safe. Dorothy Good was only 4 years old when she was accused of witchcraft. 4 years old. And even a dog was executed after being accused of helping witches. Imagine looking into the eyes of a preschooler and convincing yourself that the devil was looking at you back. Once society reaches the point where a 4-year-old and a dog become the enemies of the community, logic has already left the room. As someone who leans politically left, I can't help but think about our own moment in history. One of the things that genuinely concerns me is the rise in Christian nationalism. Not because I think that history repeats itself exactly, or because I think that we're destined for another Salem, but history does have patterns, and one of those patterns is what can happen when fear, religious certainty, and political power begin reinforcing one another. The people of Salem believed that they were protecting God. They believed that they were protecting children. They believed that they were saving their community. And they didn't think that they were participating in injustice. They thought that they were preventing it. And that's what makes Salem feel so modern to me. History isn't valuable because it tells us who to blame. It's valuable because it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about ourselves. What fears are we allowing to override evidence? Who are we treating as threats simply because someone told us that they were? And how often do we mistake certainty for truth? Those are the questions that Salem leaves me with. Because maybe Salem was never really about witches, but maybe Salem is more about us. One of my favorite ways to experience history is through fragrance. So these are 3 perfumes that I think capture a different piece of Salem in 1692. History leaves us with records, but fragrance leaves us with imagination. My first choice is Hexensalb by Stora Skogen. Ironically, this fragrance is inspired by a legendary witch's salve of European folklore. But when you actually look at the notes, rosemary, angelica, wormwood, earthly resins, it probably smells closer to a 17th century Puritan home. These were the common herbs used for cooking, medicine, and protection. I love the irony that a perfume inspired by witches ends up smelling like the very people who feared them. Next is Mirkwood by Pineward. If Hexensalb represents the homes of Salem, Mirkwood represents the world just beyond them. With notes of pine resin, cedar, myrrh, black pepper, smoke, and damp earth, it smells like the dense forests that surrounded the village. Finally, Terran Magnificence by Beaufort London. With notes of incense, smoke, weathered wood, stone, and black pepper, this fragrance feels architectural. It smells like candle smoke lingering inside old timber buildings, cold stone walls, worn wooden pews, and centuries of devotion. To me, this is the scent of Salem's meeting house, the place where sermons were preached, fears were reinforced, and accusations carried out unimaginable consequences.